Do unto others as others would do unto you. Love your neighbor as yourself.
Even if you have never sat down to read the Bible, you probably recognize some of these famous sayings from Jesus. Many of these lessons come from a collection of teachings known as the Sermon on the Mount. Some are challenging.
Love your enemy and bless those who persecute you.
And some are just plain weird.
If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off.
But underneath all these sayings is a message that God cares more about the disposition of our hearts than whether or not we simply follow the rules. So let's follow Jesus as he helps us get to the heart of it.
Well, hey, good morning and welcome to Christ Church, a church about lifting lives, elevating Christ, a church for those who aren't here yet. My name is Pastor Mike. I'm one of the pastors here on our pastoral team, and we are in the middle of our summer message called The Heart of It. And during this series, we have been closely examining Jesus' words in the Sermon on the Mount, which comes to us from the Gospel of Matthew, chapters 5 through 7. And a reminder that a gospel is one of the eyewitness accounts of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. And this sermon is one of Jesus' most powerful and most impactful, being in part because Jesus helps us through this sermon, helps us to understand the heart of God. That he begins this sermon talking about a certain blessing over people who are humble and hurting, and then begins to talk about God's heart and intention behind the law. And so the Mosaic law that was given to the Jewish people, he helps us understand God's heart behind it and what his original intention was. And so today, we are in the middle of talking about 6 of Jesus' teachings, kind of in the first half, but a little ways in which Jesus has this certain formula in the way that he speaks, in which he has 6 teachings that begin, "You have heard it said, but I say to you." And when he says, "You have heard it said," these are either things that exist in the Bible, they are laws or commandments that people would have been familiar with, or they would have been popular sayings of the age and day. And so Jesus is taking what is familiar and well-known, these commandments or these popular sayings, and he is adding God's perspective to it. He's adding an extra layer, "But I say to you," and helps explain where God's heart is behind either these laws or in contrast to what the world says about these certain topics. And last week we began with the first of these 6 teachings, which is on murder and anger, which is a pretty heavy place for Jesus to start with, but Pastor Andrew did a great job unpacking it and helping show where God's love and mercy is behind these teachings. And so if you missed it, I encourage you to go back into our archives, either on YouTube or check out our podcasts and get caught up. But we're going to continue on today with the second and third of these teachings. And so certainly because we started with such a heavy topic, certainly Jesus has a lighter one for us today. So let's see what Jesus has for us today. Oh boy. So Jesus spends his second and third teachings focusing on divorce and adultery, which is a really heavy conversation for us to be having. And I think I want to encourage you that as we go into this message today, there are 2 words of encouragement that I have for you. One is that this is a very easy discussion to check yourself out of. That either you might say, these are not 2 things that I am struggling with right now, and therefore I don't really have much of a need to tune in. Maybe I'm a kid, maybe, I'm well past the age where this is a thing, but don't check out. And also this might be a place where you might feel really guarded and really on edge in this moment because this hits really close to home. And I encourage you to stay in this discussion because Jesus has some really important things to say to us that really help us know where God's heart is and helps us know where our hearts should be as well. The second thing that I'm going to preface this discussion with is that it is good to be reminded that as Jesus is speaking in these passages, he is a man and he is also primarily speaking to other men, which if you're a woman in the room or joining us in East or online this morning, it could be very easy to take this discussion and be like, oh, it's a conversation between men, maybe it doesn't apply to me, or these words sound really harsh. But actually, in this discussion, because Jesus is talking primarily to other men, that there is a word of grace and mercy for women inside of it. And you'll see how that plays out as we get deeper into it. And so, the first topic that we're going to touch today, which is the second in the set of 6 teachings, is Jesus' teaching on adultery, which comes from Matthew 5:27 through 30. So if you got your Bible with you, I encourage you to follow along with us there. In which Jesus says, "You have heard the commandment that says you must not commit adultery. But I say, anyone who even looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So if your eye, even your good eye, causes you to lust, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your hand, even your stronger hand, causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell." And I think the first thing, there are 2 really important things that Jesus is bringing up in this passage. And the first is that sin doesn't begin with action, but sin starts in the heart. Which is to say, we might do some self-congratulation that, just the way that we talked about last week of like, you might say, well, hey God, I didn't murder anybody. Pat myself on the back, I am doing what you asked me to do. Or you might be sitting there being like, hey, I've never committed infidelity. Woo! Well, pat yourself on the back. But Jesus is challenging and saying, look, the heart behind this is so much more. That the sins that become externalized in our actions don't often start there, but it starts with a heart that is not oriented the right way. And there's even a famous example in the Bible in which this happens, in which King David commits adultery with Bathsheba. But even before he commits adultery with Bathsheba and eventually commits murder against her husband Uriah, it says that he saw her bathing on a roof and that his heart burned with passion for her. What Jesus would say in that moment is that King David's sin did not start with an action, but it started in his heart. That the moment that he saw this woman who was not his wife and desired to possess her and use her for his own selfish desires, that is when the sin crept into David's life. So it's important when we read this verse and it talks about if you even look at a woman with lust in your heart, then he commits adultery with her. That Greek word that we translate into look actually has a lot more meaning to it. That what we translate as look also means like a prolonged look, like a leering. It is an objectifying stare. And in that way, what Jesus is warning us against is having this type of objectifying stare for people who are not our spouse. That when we, it's not just that we look at somebody and we say, oh, they're pretty. Oh, no, I committed sin. I got to cut my eye out. But it is when we have that sense that we are looking at somebody with lust in our heart and we begin to fantasize and we see the needs that aren't being met in our own life and we project that somebody else is going to be able to fulfill those needs. That's where the sin begins to creep in. And an important aspect of this is that Jesus says, look, you need to look inward at your own heart, your own sense of lust, and take care of the sin that is in your own heart. Because Jesus knows that we as a society and we as human beings in our sinful nature, we don't like to look inward. We like to project our problems, even our own lusts, onto other people. And so often, we as a society, we try to blame others for our lust and temptation. I think one of the most disheartening things that happens in our dialogue when it comes to adultery and sin and infidelity and sometimes sexual assault is that when somebody is a victim, sometimes the first question that we ask is, what was she wearing? We like to take the conversation that Jesus meant to be something that causes us to look inward, and we begin to look outward and to force our own desires onto other people and make it their problem. But Jesus says, no, you need to look inward because the problem starts in your own heart. Now, there is a second important piece to this discussion that we shouldn't miss, which is that Jesus says, so if your eye, even your good eye, causes you to lust, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your hand, even your stronger hand, causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if this makes you nervous, it makes me nervous. That Jesus is using really strong language here. Like, what does he mean that I should gouge out my eye or to cut off my hand rather than to go to hell? Like, this seems like really strong language. And I want to qualify it a little bit that we can see, if it is obvious in some ways that Jesus is being hyperbolic. But because Jesus is being hyperbolic, I don't want you to miss the strength and the emphasis that Jesus is putting on this principle, which is he is asking us to ask the question of ourselves, what are you willing to cut out of your life to avoid sin and temptation? You see, Jesus uses these examples of, in the Greek, it's your right eye and your right hand, which is his way of saying, even if your best eye and even if your dominant hand is causing you to sin, it is better for you to lose that thing that you love so much and you rely on so much rather than to fall into sin. And the Greek word that we translate to hell is actually Gehenna, which was a literal place outside of Jerusalem, and it was used as a fiery trash heap. And so what he's saying is that if even the thing that is most important to you causes you to sin, it is better to get rid of that thing than to be your whole body to be thrown away in the trash. And this is hard for us to take in when it comes to this conversation around adultery, because some of us intuitively understand when it comes to other sorts of temptations, this is common sense. That if you're an alcoholic, it makes sense to stay away from the bar. And for people who have been through AA, they know that there's sometimes not even one drop. And people will even take grape juice instead of wine at communion because even that one single drop brings temptation in their lives, and they know that they need to go to extreme lengths to cut it out. But we often don't do the same thing with the temptation of lust. So often we let lust fester in our relationships that we have at work or at the hobbies that we enjoy. And there are many places in which lust enters into our lives where we begin to objectify and fantasize about people who are not our spouse. And it creeps into our lives and it causes us to sin. And we have to ask ourselves, what are we willing to give up to avoid that temptation? I think one of the obvious places where this comes in is right through this device right here. That we call it a smartphone, but it really causes us to do some dumb things, doesn't it? That through this phone, we have access to so much wonderful information about the world, but we also have temptation that comes through it. And Jesus is asking us whether we are able and willing to cut the things out of our lives that are most important, and if this is the thing that is causing you to lust or objectify people, Jesus is asking you to cut it out. Maybe you need a flip phone in your life. Maybe you need to go with no phone in your life. But if there's a place where sin is entering into your life, cut it out. This can happen at our jobs even, where the needs that we feel like we want met at home are not being met, and so we seek those things to be fulfilled through the people that we work with. And I say to you, if you're at a job where this is creeping into your life, find a new job. If you're in a career that regularly puts you in situations where you're working long nights and long hours and it's super stressful and you're traveling a lot and sin and temptation is entering into your life, you might need to change your job or change your entire career. That even if you are a doctor or a lawyer or an airline pilot or an educator or a policeman, it is better for you to change your career and to support your family by bagging groceries or washing dishes than it is for you to fall into this temptation and damage the most important relationship that you have with your spouse and with your God. What lengths are you willing to go to cut sin out of your life? Now, this discussion about adultery is connected in some ways to Jesus' teaching on divorce, which you'll see in a moment. And so this is kind of how these two things are connected in Jesus' mind. He says, "You have heard the law that says a man can divorce his wife by merely giving her a written notice of divorce. But I say that a man who divorces his wife, unless she has been unfaithful, causes her to commit adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman also commits adultery." That Jesus is connecting these ideas of the sin of adultery to lust, and also in divorce, connecting it to adultery as well. Now, this is where I need to remind everybody that a part of this discussion is, again, Jesus as a man talking primarily to other men. And this is really important because it helps frame this discussion a little bit. But I say that a man who divorces his wife, unless she has been unfaithful, causes her to commit adultery. That a man who divorces his wife for the wrong reasons puts her in a compromising position where she might have to sin as well. And whoever takes somebody as their wife who used to be somebody else's wife, Jesus is making a challenge that they might also be committing adultery as well, which is really hard for us in our culture in which divorce and remarriage is just a part of our life. And so it can be very difficult to just end on this and to feel a bit hopeless, like Jesus is putting an unbearable burden that nobody in our society can possibly live up to, because Jesus ends the discussion around adultery and divorce here. But in order to understand what Jesus really means behind this, Jesus does flesh out his ideas on divorce more thoroughly later in the Gospel of Matthew. That in Matthew chapter 15, there is a larger discussion on divorce and marriage, in which Jesus really teases out why he says these things that on the surface might seem really difficult to live by. And so in Matthew 19, verses 3 through 9, this discussion starts with some Pharisees who came and tried to trap Jesus with this question: should a man be allowed to divorce his wife for just any reason? And a couple of words to pick up on is that the author, Matthew, recognizes that this question is not being asked in earnest, that is being asked to trap Jesus. And we can kind of see this dilemma that is being offered to Jesus, which is, should a man be allowed to divorce his wife for just any reason? And this may seem strange to you because we are about 2,000 years removed from this first century debate around divorce and marriage. It would be kind of like if somebody 2,000 years from now looked back at the transcripts from the presidential debate on Thursday. They would be really confused, right? I think our same sense of confusion can seep in because we do not know the debate that the Pharisees and Jesus are steeped into. And so in order to understand this debate a little bit better, we have to go back to the Mosaic Law. And so what they are debating is the interpretation of a specific verse in Deuteronomy. So Deuteronomy chapter 24:1 says, "If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her," now the literal Hebrew translation is "finds her nakedness," or it is often used as an idiom, which means finds her unclean or shameful or indecent. If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house. Now, there were two different ways in which people were interpreting it at the time. There were two rabbis who were really influential in this debate, Rabbi Shammai and Rabbi Hillel. And each of them had developed schools that were based off of their teachings. And they could not agree on how to interpret this verse. And so with these two schools of thought, the house of Shammai came down on a more conservative and literal interpretation of Deuteronomy 24:1, which is that infidelity is the only valid reason for divorce. That quite literally, unless a man finds his wife naked with somebody else, then he is not allowed to divorce her. Now, Rabbi Hillel developed a theology saying, like, no, it's not quite that literal, that it means just any state of uncleanness or shamefulness that allows one to properly divorce their spouse. And a hard part that we are missing in this conversation is the ramifications that it has for women. That in the first century, women were not allowed to issue a divorce to their husband, that they were not allowed to initiate divorce unless you were fabulously wealthy. There are only a few cases that we've ever found of a woman initiating divorce in the Jewish culture in the first century. And so, and even in those cases, a man had to appear in court on her behalf to help see it through the legal system. And so the debate here, while to us we might see this is the more intuitive option with our 21st century eyes, we might be surprised that Jesus actually falls closer to this first one. Because he knows that if people are allowed to divorce their wives for just any reason, for flippant reasons, or reasons that don't amount to faithfulness with God's covenant, that it puts women in a really compromising situation. That women were not in a good position to support themselves economically. And so if somebody was divorced, unless they had a rich family to go back to, they were often cut off economically from their society, and their prospects of being remarried were really slim. And so they were often sentenced to a life of poverty, being divorced, in a way that it is not that quite a harsh of sentence to us in the 21st century, which is why Jesus comes more on this side, and you'll see in just a second. So again, some Pharisees came and tried to trap Jesus with this question: should a man be allowed to divorce his wife for just any reason? And catch what Jesus says here. Haven't you read the scriptures? Jesus replied, they record that from the beginning God made them male and female, bringing this all the way back to Genesis 1:27. From the very creation, from the very beginning, he wants to talk about God's intention for marriage. And he says, this explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. Since they are no longer two but one, let no one split apart what God has joined together. You see, the Pharisees ask a question about the technicalities of divorce, and Jesus responds with God's original vision for marriage, which is that two people become united as one. And he says, let no one split apart what God has joined together, because God's vision is an everlasting union, two hearts united as one. Now, the natural question that comes up in response to this The Pharisees, they have their thumbs on it. They say, well, then why did Moses say in the law that a man could give his wife a written notice of divorce and send her away? If God's intention was that no one should ever be split apart, why in the world would Moses write in the law that a man could divorce his wife? And watch Jesus' answer here as well. Jesus replied, Moses permitted divorce only as a concession to your hard hearts, but it was not what God had originally intended. And I tell you this, whoever divorces his wife and marries someone else commits adultery unless his wife has been unfaithful. You see, at the heart of this discussion is that divorce only exists as a concession for our hard hearts. That when Jesus helps us get to the heart of it, what he says is that God never wanted us to be divorced, but only because us as human beings, our hearts become so hardened to the person that we are supposed to love the most in this life, that divorce is in some ways an act of mercy, even in the middle of a situation that God never wanted to happen in the first place. And I'll never forget this moment in which I was talking with a pastoral mentor of mine about 10 years ago, back when I was a youth director. And I was asking him how life was going, and he said, this season has been really heavy with marriage counseling. And me, in my naivete as a 25-year-old, I was like, that must be really hard work, but it also must be really fulfilling that you are able to help couples come back together and solve their issues and really, become strengthened in their marriage. That must be so rewarding. And he looked at me with really sad eyes, and he took a deep breath. And he said, you know what? The reality is that most of the people who come to see me for marriage counseling still end up getting divorced. He said, often when people finally admit that they have enough of a problem that they want to see a pastor, one or both of the people who are there, their hearts are so hardened towards each other that they don't actually want to fix their marriage. Many of them only come to see me because they want permission from their pastor to get divorced. And I said, that's really depressing. And I said, well, then why, if it seems so hopeless, why do you do it? Why do you spend so much time in marriage counseling with people when it so rarely seems to help or work out? And what he said to me is this. He said, I believe in a God of miracles. That the God who can turn water into wine and turn 2 loaves of bread and fish into a meal for 5,000 people, that God can make even the hardest hearts soft again. And I have to believe in that God every time that I meet with a couple. You see, when we enter into this discussion about divorce, we, like the Pharisees, tend to ask the wrong questions. We tend to ask the questions of whether it's, mostly good or mostly bad, or whether it's allowed or not allowed in this certain test case. But what Jesus tries to reframe the question for us is, do we have soft hearts for each other like God has for us? Do we have soft hearts for each other the way that God has for us? Because I don't have to tell you, if you are somebody who is having a rocky time in your relationship, or you have been divorced, or you're a child of divorce, that divorce can be the most painful and hurtful thing to go through. But God's heart has always been for you. That God's heart has always remained soft for you, even as your heart hardens towards the person that you committed to loving your entire life. And God's soft heart for you means that there is still hope for miracles in the future if you find yourself on the edge of ending your relationship. And there's a couple of ways in which, because we have forgotten this principle of God's soft heart towards people, sometimes we have wielded Jesus' teachings around divorce in ways that compound the harm on people, in ways that I don't think that Jesus ever imagined. You see, one of the ways is that by Jesus limiting the discussion around permissible reasons to get divorced by saying only adultery, I don't think that Jesus was taking what was meant to be a challenge towards men and making it a chain towards women. And so I say this to you: if you are in a relationship where you are unsafe, Jesus' soft heart towards you is not one that condemns you to stay in an unsafe place forever just because you haven't caught your spouse cheating. That what was meant as a gift to help protect women was never meant to hurt women. And likewise, in this discussion, we as a church often have failed that with people who have gotten divorced, we have heaped on shame and stigma upon them to the point that sometimes we even excommunicate them, which means to not allow them to take communion. But Jesus' soft heart for you means that he never intended this teaching to become a place in which you were cut off from his grace and his mercy. That I say to you, if you are here and you've been through a divorce, you are still welcome at Jesus' table because God has always had a soft heart for you. So let us not come into a place where we deny the challenge that Jesus gives us, but may we remember the first principle, that Jesus and God have loved us and continue to have soft hearts for us no matter what. Amen. Let's pray. God, we ask for your mercy and your grace, that even as our hearts harden towards the people that we were meant to love, even as we objectify people who are not our own and we no longer even see them as human, God, I ask that you help soften our hearts, that we might see what your original intention was for our relationships with other people to be like, that you might help us to understand what it was that your son Jesus came to do in his sacrifice for us, that in his life and his death and his resurrection, he came to free us from the power of sin, a sin that we bring on ourselves at times. God, help us in the middle of our challenges, that if there is sin in our life that we need to cut out, God, give us the sense of clarity and conviction to cut those things out of our lives, that we might prioritize you and the people that we are supposed to love the most. And God, we also ask that even in the middle of relationships that seem doomed to fail, God, I ask for your grace and your mercy, that you would help us to have soft hearts toward each other, that we believe that you are a God of miracles, and even in the most hopeless situations, God, we know that you can do incredible things and help bring restoration and life to your people. So God, for these and so many more promises that you keep towards us, we give you thanks. We love you so much, and it's in your name we pray. Amen.